Stay sold. Take one.
All right. I don't know why I felt compelled to put that Cliff Burton reference in there, but yeah. For those of you who know about Kill 'Em All and Anesthesia Pulling Teeth, there's your Metallica reference. I guess because this is the second take, I actually recorded a full hour-long podcast episode for this, and it just wasn't up to my standard. I know I'm bottom tier collector and I pump out the most bottom tier content in the community. That's just part of what I do, and I'm proud of it. But I felt like I was just talking to myself for an hour with no real point or direction. And so we're going to try this again. What I learned from 80s wrestling. Now, for those of you new to the channel, this is a podcast series. I'm now taking this over as a podcast series. All my wrestling content from here on out, except for some things I have planned in the future, are going to be podcast format episodes. So you can just listen to them. There's no real incentive for you guys to stare at your phones while I talk about wrestling for an hour plus. It's what I tend to do on these wrestling episodes. So I just took myself off the camera, and we're doing podcast format. I've been doing a WrestleMania series. We've done the first 5 WrestleManias, and it hasn't been brutal. I don't want to make it seem like that. I raced through the first 3 WrestleManias. I had just a total blast, reminiscing the past, learning a lot about the first 3 WrestleManias. WrestleMania 4, I got kind of busy during my downtime prior to work each day. So it got a little hard for me to stay on track with the momentum of watching these WrestleManias. And then that kind of spilled into WrestleMania 5, where it took me longer than expected to get the episode out. And so I just thought it would be fun to kind of change up the pace. My ADD has kicked in. And talk about 80s wrestling, because at the end of WrestleMania 5, it's 1989, and the next WrestleMania I will review will be in 1990, WrestleMania 6. So I think it'd be fun to kind of discuss what I learned about in the 80s. And also, I've got a little experience from before the Rocking Wrestling era. I think I watched one episode of Championship Wrestling, which is early 80s, during the Bob Backlund title run. And then I'm like halfway through an episode of WWF Old School. Now, this is when Vince Sr. owned the company. And it's really interesting to just go back to 1973, which is their oldest match on Peacock, and see where the WWF came from. And I just think all my wrestling experience and viewing makes for an interesting commentary, I think. So what I've realized about 80s wrestling is it holds a special place in my heart, not necessarily for the entertainment factor. Like, one thing I've learned about watching modern, like, current wrestling, the entertainment factor, I think, is better than it's ever been. And I don't mean specific wrestlers are not entertaining, but I just mean, even with the exception of your smaller companies like your NWAs, I hesitate to say Ring of Honor now that Tony Khan has purchased Ring of Honor, but your MLWs, or this other upstart company I just got a hold of, Dungeon Wrestling, or your Ohio Valley Wrestling. You guys get it. You hardcore wrestling fans understand what I'm talking about. The AEWs, the New Japans, the WWEs, those companies are just next level entertainment companies. I think the move selling across the board in the entire locker room is much better than it was in the 80s. I think the move selection, like, each wrestler is pretty solid at their move selection now compared to back then. Even the one-trick pony guys like a Brock Lesnar, or your big strongman archetype wrestlers today that I forget his name. Is it Ethan Cage? Oh, I can't remember. The big guy who's clearly on steroids in the AEW that got moved over to Ring of Honor. Oh, I can't remember his name. He's got a mohawk, and he's just this huge behemoth of a man. Uh, yeah, I can't remember. Guys like that are just like, they've only got a few tricks in the bag. Even they're really good at their execution and their move selection. It really seems diverse. Where opposed as back in the 80s, and we'll get into this a little further later into the episode, but back in the 80s, it wasn't quite so much. You saw the same types of moves from most of the roster every match. And not to say that it's boring, but I just realized that about 80s wrestling is that it's kind of the start where we're kind of getting out of traditional Roman Greco wrestling and we're starting to see a little more entertainment. And the move selections kind of go hand in hand with that. Because they're not working the mat as much anymore. They're going for more aerial attacks. They're going for more slams. They're going for more stuff that's going to get a pop from the crowd, right? Because a 30-minute sharpshooter is not going to get a lot of pop from the crowd. Whereas you watch today, like WrestleMania 39, I think I saw like 3 submission holds all night one. Not saying that that's a bad thing. I was very entertained, especially with the Rhea Ripley and Charlotte Flair match. But it was just a lot of high impact, high spot moves that get popped that really jaw drop the crowd. I just saw last week's AEW episode, the Trios Championship match between House of Black and Best Friends. And Orange Cassidy, there we go. Orange Cassidy and Malachi Black had a couple moments in the ring during the Trios Championship match that just really opened my eyes at the move selection, the way they were so able to reverse each other, and it was just fluid. There wasn't hesitation. It didn't feel scripted. It just felt like, instinct for them to wrestle like that. And not so much in the 80s. A lot of wrestlers just don't have that kind of stuff. And I guess the wrestling schools were very old school and traditional back then, I guess. Wrestling just hadn't come that far yet in the 80s, but it was getting there, and you can tell. One thing I love about the 80s, one thing I've learned to realize about the 80s, the crowds, it's kind of a mix of the 70s wrestling crowds where, in the 70s, on this episode of Old School, there's fans that literally come up to the ring and talk crap. And I guess that's kind of why security barriers are a thing in wrestling now and became a thing in the 80s. But it's just funny. There's this one lady who's a super fan. I even read up on her in this episode of Old School from 73. Vincent McMahon Jr. even acknowledges this lady, Miss Krieger. I assumed at first she was a paid fan. One of the wrestlers, Tanaka, does this pre-match routine where he rubs salt around the ring to ward away the bad spirits. It's just a little gimmick or whatever. And this old decrepit lady comes up to the ring and wipes away the salt. I thought it was a totally paid thing, and apparently she was just a super fan. Came up there out of her own free will, wasn't paid, wasn't coaxed into acting like that. And there's a story, I read up on it, there's like a forum post about her on some wrestling website. One heel wrestler got irritated with her shaking her cane at him, so he snapped her cane. And then the WWF even furnished her with a cane after her cane was snapped. So those are the kinds of crowds you got in the 70s, and I feel like the 80s are just kind of where we've come from. They're kind of a mix of where we came from, without the security barriers and talking trash to the wrestlers. Because until WrestleMania 4, WrestleMania 3 is, you're still getting trash thrown into the ring. And this is 1987. It's pretty late in the 80s, and we're still getting trash thrown in the ring. I mean, and then you watch WCW in the 90s, and there's trash thrown in the ring when Hogan drops the leg on Macho Man. So that kind of stuff is still going to be around for years to come. But I've just kind of noticed at the mainstream level of wrestling fandom, just that old school talking trash, really getting into it, really believing this is all real, is still there in the 80s crowd, but you still have this element of people are there to be entertained. It's a spectacle. It's more than just a sporting event. So it's kind of a good clash, a good mix of both vibes, and it really makes some of the crowds are really special at some of these WrestleManias and some of these events I've seen from the 80s. The refereeing is kind of takes a turning point in the 80s, harkening back to that 1973 episode. The referee, it's one referee the whole time in this old school episode, and it looks like he just threw on his Sunday best. He's got like some khakis and a polo and some dress shoes. He's like even chewing bubblegum as he's refereeing. And this is the WWF. This is like the prime time of the NWA, of the wrestling sports industry, right? And this guy's chewing bubblegum and like, it's just like Joe Schmo, like it's his part-time job on Saturday nights. He referees for a six-pack of beer or something. And, we come a long way from that in the 80s. We've actually got refereeing uniforms. They're actually wearing bow ties. And it seems like they're actually following a rule book in the 70s and 80s. It kind of goes away today. Seems like the referees are more of just a prop. They're just there to count the pins nowadays. But back then, the referees seemed like they were following an actual official rule book on professional wrestling. But sometimes it kind of gets irritating. Sometimes the refs tend to get in the wrestler's way, and I appreciate when the heels will shove the referees off of them. It's something you don't really see anymore. Heels really bullying the referees. That's more of an old school heel type of thing. And I really enjoyed seeing that. And I will say one thing, I'll give credit to the new referees. They're way better at not giving a third count on the mat unless it's a scripted, meant to look like a pinfall, really close kind of thing. You almost never see a third pin hand hit the mat during a pin count if there's a kick out. Whereas back then, I get confused a lot watching some of these matches, and you see a third pin count and like the opponent wins and you're confused. You're just like, how could this happen? There was a pinfall victory here and the match is still going on. So sometimes I'll get a little confused. And something I just learned to realize about refereeing in the 80s, they haven't come as far as they've needed to come. Even though I appreciate them sticking to, I guess, an official rule book on professional wrestling. I also would have to say, not every wrestler, the storylines were different back then. There was more long-form storytelling, and then the feuds. I've noticed some of the feuds, you just kind of drifted in and out of your feuds, and you would just like square off on and off with your rivals. Whereas today, and not so much in the AEW, but especially in the WWE, and this was really prevalent at the end of the Attitude Era and the beginning of the PG era, where you started a feud at the end of a pay-per-view and you went all the way through your month, and then at the next pay-per-view, you resolved your feud, and that was it. You went on to the next feud after that. That was the WWE formula 15, 20 years ago. I'm not so much aware of what's going on nowadays and what they do in the WWE now. But back in the 80s, it's more about long-form storytelling. I mean, especially you look at the NWA and Dusty Rhodes and Ric Flair feuded for years. What seems like the entire 80s was the Ric Flair-Dusty Rhodes feud. And it was only a couple of years in its heightened state. But you also got the Mega Power storyline that went on for a full year. You got a full fleshed out storyline. You have Hogan coming out to the ring at WrestleMania 4 to congratulate Macho Man and celebrate with him. Hit DiBiase with that chair to get revenge on DiBiase and earn Macho Man that strap. Then they form the Mega Powers, and by SummerSlam 88, it doesn't seem like it can get any bigger than Hogan and Macho Man And then you start to see some erosion taking place around Survivor Series and going into Royal Rumble, where, and then you get to February and March Saturday night main events where Macho Man and Hulk Hogan have turned on each other. And it culminates in WrestleMania 5, the explosion of the Mega Powers, where Hogan and Macho Man duke it out for the title. You don't really have that long form storytelling anymore, and it's something I miss, from 80s wrestling. Another thing that I've learned about 80s wrestling, especially in the WWF, the tag team wrestling is top tier. Oh my gosh, they were so deep in the 80s with tag teams. I don't know if the tag team division has been that deep since. I mean, you have the Hart Foundation, you have the British Bulldogs, you have Demolition, you have Warlord and the Barbarian, the Powers of Pain. You have the Megabucks, which are kind of a a non-tag team. That kind of team up. Part of the Heenan family teams up to suit the story. They don't really push for tag titles. But you also got the Rougeau brothers. You also got the Twin Towers, Akeem and Big Boss Man. And I'm sure there's plenty of other tag teams that you got Strike Force, Rick Martel and Tito Santana. And of course, there was the Mega Powers, but I don't really consider them. They're like a non-tag team. Tag team. I'm trying to sit here trying to think. I'm sure there was many other tag teams out there, but I just can't think of them. But yeah, the tag team division was so good. You got the Midnight Rockers. Just thought of them. The Midnight Rockers were a fantastic tag team. Loved seeing them come over from AWA to the WWF in '89. Or '88, I should say. Uh, yeah, the tag team belts really mattered in the '80s. It doesn't seem like they matter as much anymore. And it seemed like there was a lot of good teams that could have broken off into solo acts, and they just really had a lot of the teams had a lot of good chemistry. They worked good together with each other. The teams in the ring, and I really really enjoy seeing that tag team division from the golden age of wrestling. Another thing I've learned about 80s wrestling is it seems like there's an unspoken rule that you just don't give the fans what they want. You don't give them a clean finish. I think it's WrestleMania. Is it WrestleMania 1? It's either WrestleMania 1 or WrestleMania 2 where there's just disqualification after disqualification. And I love a good disqualification match. I like when it suits a storyline, but I just can't stand when two wrestlers just get into a ring in just a standard exhibition match and it ends in disqualification. I'd like to see just a standard, here's two guys in a ring and they're going to wrestle. There's no like build up. There's no backstory. It's not a storyline. It's not a feud. It's just two guys wrestling each other. I'd like to see a clean pin from time to time. And then in a championship match, I'd like to see clean pins most of the time. And the tag team division, as much as I was just bragging on them, as much as I love the tag team division of old, there were so many disqualifications in tag matches back then. And I just don't feel like disqualifications happen as much anymore. It's almost, I kind of almost have the adverse opinion about today's wrestling and disqualification finishes. I actually would like to see more disqualifications nowadays. We don't see them as much anymore. We mostly get, it seems like it's 99% clean pin matches. Another thing that I've come to understand about 80s wrestling, holy cow, the managers. Bobby the Brain Heenan and Jimmy Hart were workhorses. I mean, I cannot imagine all the walking Bobby Heenan had to do in WrestleMania 3 especially. And then Jimmy Hart was all over the place in WrestleMania 4. just an incredible thing to realize, just the amount of work the managers had to put in the WWF. I mean, they weren't wrestling, but man, were they working sometimes harder than most of the wrestlers. And managers are kind of a dead thing these days. I mean, you still got them. I forget his name, but the guy that manages Kenny Omega and the Young Bucks in AEW, he's there, and you got Sting mentoring Darby Allin, and Matt Hardy's kind of in more of a managerial position now. Uh, I'm not too aware of managers in the WWF. When I watched WrestleMania 39, I don't think I saw a single manager coming out to the ring. So, just kind of a thing that's kind of old school and kind of dead is the manager or the valet, like a male wrestler coming out with a female. That's just not really a thing anymore. And that was something that was huge back in the 80s. And I'm not sure if I have a definitive thought either way on it. Sometimes the managers are irritating and annoying, and I don't need them. But sometimes it's cool for diversity, to see wrestlers have managers, and it's just something that's kind of dead in today's day and age. What managers there are today, they don't work near as hard as Bobby the Brain did, or Jimmy the Heart, or even Slick. Slick gets on my nerves. He's irritating. He's just heel manager. I love to see get beat up, but he was a hard worker. I can't deny that. He's all over the place, and just kudos to the managers back in the 80s. Some wrestlers I've come to realize about. Now, I don't want to talk about every wrestler on the roster, and I mostly want to talk about wrestlers that have impressed me. But what I've learned from the 80s and wrestlers that have impressed me, holy cow, Roddy Piper. I think Vince McMahon missed a great opportunity to make him a great heel champion. But he is a fantastic character. I love him for the industry. And a guy that I've not really known a whole heck of a lot about until this WrestleMania review series. But man, am I glad I've gotten to know him a little bit. Really like seeing Roddy Piper. Ricky the Steamboat Dragon, my gosh. I think I said this in my WrestleMania 3 review, that match between him and Macho Man puts him over as the greatest babyface of all time, and I still stand with that opinion to this day. I say to this day, but that opinion's only been a couple months long. But yeah, Ricky the Steamboat is a fantastic wrestler. I would argue against anyone that Ricky Steamboat is just as good as any wrestler there ever was, or better. Just Ricky Steamboat is like watching water flow through a river. He's just so fluid with his moves. He seems light as a feather on his feet. He can play heel and be convincing, because I've seen him bully the refs, which is a heel thing. I've seen him play the white bread babyface hero, which I think he should have been a champion. I don't know if he had the personality to be a long-time champion in the WWF, but he sure had the wrestling to be a champion in the WWF, and should have been more than an Intercontinental Champion, in my opinion. Andre the Giant, I don't get it. Like I understand the old guard saw Andre the Giant back in his territory days before TV color, and Andre the Giant could move. He could wrestle back then. He had flexibility in his joints back then. So I kind of get it from the old guard and why they respect Andre the Giant, but I don't get why so many people these days consider Andre one of these greatest wrestlers of all time. I'll give you all day that Andre might be one of the greatest characters wrestling has ever had. I think as a character, he's fantastic for the WWF. I think it's wonderful that they had this behemoth of a man, this immovable object, this guy they call the eighth wonder of the world, so intimidating, so awkward to wrestle. I like that. But if you're going to grade the man's wrestling and call him one of the great wrestlers of all time, he's got to be easily the most overrated wrestler of all time. There's like 5 moves Andre does between WrestleMania 1 and WrestleMania 5. And WrestleMania 3 was such a travesty. It's his championship match moment. And he spends a lot of time just like resting and catching his breath, leaning up on the turnbuckle and the ropes. It's really disappointing to watch. And I don't want to sit here and bash on Andre. I understand he was knocking on death's door by the mid to late '80s. I don't. He definitely doesn't make it out of the '90s. But it's just hard to watch him wrestle sometimes. He can barely walk, like walking on stilts. And I noticed by the late '80s, he's lost a little bit of weight, and he can move a lot better than he did at WrestleMania 3. And I feel like he cut down a little bit to help his joints out. Uh, so I like Andre kind of later in the '80s. He's got more energy. He's more aggressive. But in the mid '80s at least, when he's still playing a face, and by the time we get to WrestleMania 3, it's just like watching a man walk on stilts. Um, Big John Studd. I haven't gotten to see a lot of Big John Studd, and apparently Big John Studd's prime is in the '70s and early '80s. So I need to go find more tape on Big John Studd. But what I have seen of John Studd, I really liked his feud with Andre the Giant. I liked his mini comeback, winning the 1989 Royal Rumble. There's a Saturday night's main event, or it could be, yeah, I think it's a Saturday night's main event. He comes to Jake the Snake's aid in the Jake the Snake Andre feud and has a stare down with Andre. And I don't think it ever got fulfilled, but I really have a soft spot for Big John Studd. I think he's a fantastic personality. I think he's a great character. He's a behemoth of a man. And I would have liked to have seen more tape on Big John Studd in this WrestleMania series I'm doing. Let's see here. Who else can I talk about? The Ultimate Warrior. I think by default, I loved Ultimate Warrior just as a kid. When you first see Ultimate Warrior, it's like, oh my gosh, this guy is incredible. He's just wild man. He's huge and roided up. And I think I've have a full appreciation of Ultimate Warrior now. I love the gimmick. I love the way he wrestles. It kind of fits with what he's trying to do on the mic and with his look. And he's so over. Oh my gosh, he's so over. And I think Hogan kept him down for too long. I think Macho Man and Ultimate Warrior, their title run should have happened a couple years earlier, in my opinion. And we'll get into a little bit of that later on as well. But yeah, I think I really like Ultimate Warrior. He's really good for the company. I've only ever heard the WWE side of the story to why he fell out with the WWE. Apparently, he would miss a lot of shows, but I don't think I can blame anybody for missing shows. It's a brutal schedule. You get no time off. And I just cannot blame Ultimate Warrior for wanting to be with his family. In my opinion, that makes him a good man. You can't blame anybody for wanting to spend time with their family away from work. And if you're going to be in the WWF, it's a really demanding schedule, and you don't get paid if you don't work. So it's just really kind of a rock and a hard place for some of these wrestlers. And I would like to find an interview or something where Jim Warrior gives his take, his story on things, so I can kind of get the other side of the story on why he fell out with the WWF. Let's see here. Bret Hart. I need to talk about Bret Hart. He is a big time heel in the 80s, and it caught me off guard. I'm so used to Bret Hart with his feud with Stone Cold, where Bret Hart is totally over as this hero, this baby face, clean-cut guy that's not very good on the mic. I'm going to kick your butt, Stone Cold, and you're going to bleed for a week. You're messing with a lion, Stone Cold. That's the Bret Hart I'm used to. And seeing him work the mic and like when he trashes the trophy at WrestleMania 4, I was like stunned seeing him use Jimmy Hart's megaphone to dirty attack other wrestlers. It's just not something I'm used to. He's actually solid on the mic in some of his promos. Did he have a silver tongue? No, he did not. But he was still really good on the mic, really confident. And I really took what he was trying to do seriously. Something I can't do with him in the 90s. Haven't yet to see him flex his wrestling prowess. This guy's the excellent of execution. And from the Saturday night main events, the Royal Rumbles, and the Survivor Series, and the WrestleManias I've seen that Bret Hart's been in, I just have not yet got to see that legendary match I know he's capable of giving. But overall, I'm still impressed with Bret Hart, and I think I prefer heel Bret Hart so much in the 80s to face Bret Hart in the 90s. Davey Boy Smith, another guy I have to bring up. I think, honestly, now, who knows with Billy Jack Haynes? If we had gotten a full career out of Billy Jack Haynes, who knows if my opinion of Davey Boy Smith would still be this way? Because Billy Jack Haynes really dropped my jaw at WrestleMania 3. But Davey Boy Smith, holy cow. As far as people that got a full career out of the WWF and pro wrestling, Davey Boy Smith is the most incredible strongman archetype wrestler. And when I talk about strongmen, I mean the jacked, roided out guys that were super cut, low body fat guys that were doing the high impact strongman slams and stuff. And Davey Boy Smith could really get in there and be technical. He could also do different forms of slams, and just really a diverse moveset with Davey Boy. And I like this whole look. He just looked huge, and I like the pants, the British flag on his pants. And while he wasn't excellent on the mic, he still brought it in the ring. And when he would slam people, it just felt like the entire arena would shake. He was really good at just executing his moves. Curt Hennig. Now, I've seen the beginning of Curt Hennig in 88 and 89, and it's easy to see why he's in the Hall of Fame. He died way too young. He fell out with the WWF way too young. His injuries mounted up so bad that he needed to take time off from wrestling. And what a tragedy it was that the injuries mounted too much for Curt Hennig, that he had to kind of back away from the ring. I saw him in WrestleMania 4, I believe, and I've seen him in WrestleMania 5. Incredible wrestler. He had tons of heat on the mic. He's definitely part of that new generation crowd where they were getting a lot better on the mic. They were way more convincing in their characters. Less larger than life and more somebody you can take seriously and relate to and kind of understand a little better. Just Curt Hennig, Mr. Perfect, has really impressed me from what I've seen of him. I'm becoming a big fan of him, and he's rising up my ranks big time. I'm gonna talk about one last wrestler, and then we'll move on to one last thing I'd like to talk about. Things I would do about 80s wrestling. But Junkyard Dog, I really appreciate Junkyard Dog. I think he's a fun gimmick, kind of, I would assume he gets a little dated in the 90s. I know he goes to the WWE, the WCW in the 90s, and I would imagine he would feel a little dated. But for the 80s and for the time, I think he's a wonderful character. He put on some really good matches with people. Not the most technical wrestler in the world, but man, that WrestleMania 2 match with the Funk Brothers was really awesome. I got some laughs out of his WrestleMania 3 match with Harley Race. His WrestleMania 1 match for the Intercontinental Championship with Greg Valentine was a really, really good match. And I think Junkyard Dog is just a hidden gem, a product of a time gone by, and I really wish Junkyard Dog could have been champion, at least for a couple months. And now I'd like to segue into some thoughts I have about how 80s wrestling, the story of the WWF in the 80s worked out. the history of it, I would have wrote it a little different. I've been critical of 80s wrestling, and I believe you shouldn't be too critical of things you don't have a solution for. So, how I would have written 80s wrestling, then when I refer to 80s wrestling, I'm really talking about the moment Bob Backlund drops the belt to Iron Sheik all the way to the end of 1989. And I wouldn't have had Iron Sheik beat Bob Backlund in 84. I'd have had Roddy Piper be the champion. I would have had Roddy Piper defeat Bob Backlund in 1984. And I would have had him run all the way to War to Settle the Score on MTV, their big push in the 80s, right before WrestleMania 1. And the main event that happened at WrestleMania 1, I would have had that at the MTV push. Getting Mr. T on MTV, Cyndi Lauper on MTV. I think it would have done more to expand the reach of the WWF and getting to a younger audience. Had they had that main event, that tag match happened at WrestleMania 1 at MTV, and then the main event for WrestleMania 1, I would have had Piper and Hogan being the challenger, not the defending champion at WrestleMania 1. And I would have had Hogan win his first title at WrestleMania. I think that would have put him over a lot bigger. I think it would have put him over a lot faster. I would have had somewhere by the summer, I'd have had Junkyard Dog. With how over he was, I'd have had Junkyard Dog in a clean face versus face match. I know this kind of stuff doesn't happen as often in the 80s, but I had a clean face versus face match and actually have Junkyard Dog defeat Hogan for the title, only to have Junkyard Dog get squashed by King Kong Bundy, let's say at the very next Saturday Night Main Event, and really begin this build of making King Kong Bundy this dominant heel champion. One thing that should have happened more often than not in the 80s is heel champions. They would put the faces over big time if they would have had heel champions in the way I'd have done it. Squashing Junkyard Dog. This is the man that beat the man that beat the man. It would have made Bundy look legitimate. And there's that storyline of Bundy giving Hogan an avalanche on a Saturday night's main event prior to WrestleMania 2. And I just had that play out where Hogan's got the ribs injured, and I had all the continuity going in the ring. I complained about the rib continuity in my WrestleMania 2 review. I'd have had Hogan playing to those ribs and being the challenger. You'd have had the crowd on the edge of their seats wondering if he could actually defeat Bundy. And what the way the match played at WrestleMania 3 between Andre and Hogan, I'd have had that at WrestleMania 2. I'd have had Bundy and Hogan be the David versus Goliath match. I'd have had Bundy dominate Hogan, and then Hogan getting a last-minute offense in, hulking up in the final midnight hour, and leg-dropping Bundy for the title. I think the crowd would have gone more nuts than they already did at WrestleMania 2. I think the story would have been a lot better. I think it would have been a lot more gratifying to have Hogan overcome all the obstacles to defeat King Kong Bundy for the WWF Championship. And then the real title push would have started at WrestleMania 2. I had Hogan defend and go all the way to WrestleMania 3 with the title at WrestleMania 3. And then the match we got at WrestleMania 4 between Hogan and Andre, where Andre had a lot more energy, he was a lot more aggressive, and it felt like a more even battle. That would have been my fight at WrestleMania 3. You got the two biggest personalities in wrestling. Granted, we've got Ric Flair and Dusty Rhodes down there in the NWA to lighten up arenas. But let's be honest, the WWF was much bigger by the time we got to WrestleMania 3 than the NWA. More people were watching and caring about Hulk Hogan and Andre in 1987. And I'd have had Hogan and Andre beating the snot out of each other. Not Andre dominating Hogan. I'd have made it feel like both guys are doing all they can to put it all on the line, leave it all in the ring for that title. And I'd have had Hogan defend his title at WrestleMania 3. I'd then have the Saturday night main event play out like it did. I'd have DiBiase pay Andre to get the strap off Hogan in a cheap match, and then try to give it to DiBiase, but then President Jack Tunney forces DiBiase and Andre to vacate the title since they didn't win it legally, and they hold the tournament at WrestleMania 4. Now, would I have had the tournament play out like it would have? No. I would have had the best of the best be in that tournament. I'd have had Davey Boy Smith in the tournament. Of course, Ultimate Warrior was there. I'd have Ultimate Warrior be in the tournament. Ricky Steamboat, Greg Valentine, Hulk Hogan, Andre, Hercules even. There was that one-man gang match. I forget who he fights. I wouldn't have had one-man gang in that match. I wouldn't have had. I would have had Bret Hart in that match. Maybe I would have put one-man gang in the 20-man battle royal. I'd have had Junkyard Dog in that tournament because I would have wanted to make it feel like the best of the best of the best were in that WWF title tournament, and you could still have Macho Man win organically that way, and not have this subplot of DiBiase fixing the match so that DiBiase can get over or get the strap once and for all. You have Macho Man with the title, Hogan coming out to the ring. They start the Mega Powers, although I would slow build it. Maybe they don't shake hands. Maybe they don't have that promo where they're like, I don't know what's happening, man. It feels like the earth's going to shatter if we connect. I would have slow built the Mega Powers into SummerSlam. And I would have had Macho Man somewhere in between WrestleMania 4 and SummerSlam drop the title to Ted DiBiase and have DiBiase go on to WrestleMania 5 with the title as one of the greatest heel champions of all time. Everybody would have hated DiBiase going into WrestleMania 5 if he would cheat and pay his way to WrestleMania 5 as defending champion. And you can also tie in, since DiBiase is part of the Heenan family, you can tie in that wonderful Jake the Snake Andre feud for the strap. You could have Jake the Snake pushing. It would put Jake the Snake over and make your locker room deeper, in my opinion, if you did it this way. Because that feud between Andre and Jake the Snake in 88-89 is fantastic. And it gets resolved at WrestleMania 5. And you could have that play out and be the main premier feud. Jake the Snake and Andre and DiBiase, have the title involved. While the Mega Powers, Hogan and Macho, decide to dominate the tag team division. I don't know what fan wouldn't have wanted to see Hogan and Macho Man defend tag titles in 88 and 89. And then you could have the Mega Powers explode at Royal Rumble 89 and then clean it up, wrap it up at Royal Rumble, and set up Hogan for another title win. If you have to have Hogan win at WrestleMania 5 to shut down the 80s, you could have enough time, a couple months, to get Hogan ready for his title push at WrestleMania 5 and fight DiBiase, which I would think it would have been an incredible match. The reason why I wouldn't have had the Mega Powers be the premier storyline if I was Vince McMahon is because really Macho Man needs time to breathe and be a solo champion. And then Hogan, it just feels like Hogan can't be away from the title. A lot of wrestlers say a great wrestler makes the belt. The belt doesn't make them. And it feels definitely like the belt makes Hogan. Like he can't live without the belt. Even when he's not champion, he's got to be around Macho Man, the man with the strap. And it's just kind of irritating to me to see Macho Man have to be in Hulk Hogan's shadow during his freaking WWF title run. It's irritating. So, while the storyline is great, I wouldn't want to get rid of that Mega Power storyline. I would just have it be in the tag team division. And that's how I would shut down the 80s. Hogan and DiBiase fighting it out at WrestleMania 5 for the strap. Those are my thoughts. That's what I've learned about wrestling from the 80s. It holds a special place in my heart. I'm looking forward to WrestleMania 6, guys. Thank you for listening. If you made it this far, God bless you. Thank you for all the likes, subscribes, comments. Hope you enjoyed this. This was made for the real ones, the wrestling fans who are subscribed and watch my content. Hope you enjoy it. If any of my takes, any of my opinions were hot and juicy, please feel free to leave them in the comments. I'd love to discourse, love to have some discourse with you guys and talk wrestling. Until next time, guys.